The protagonist sits in front of his computer, which is 24 inches, has a 16:9 aspect ratio, and has a top-quality screen resolution. He sits in front of his computer for days and nights. This is his whole life. He quickly beats his fingers on the keyboard while he writes one of his 1,000 comments, filling them with bile and hatred for people. It is reported that the main character is unprincipled. He leaves hundreds of reviews on the forums, discussing with some strangers, proving something. During his dialogues on the forums, he very often lies, inventing something about his life and its attributes. He lives in a world of perverted desires. He is indifferent to everything that happens, except for what happens in his computer. Even when his mom offers to go on a trip with them, he throws his phone away, showing his indifference and disinterest. His mother is very worried that her son constantly sits within four walls. He does not leave them for an hour, so she suggests that he go out and at least stay outside for a while to change the situation. His mother persuades him to go with them, saying that perhaps this is their last vacation, when they can get together again with the whole family. Because their father is very often on business trips and is almost never at home, but our hero's mother's requests and her prayers are absolutely unimportant. Moreover, he snaps from behind his door, saying that he asked her never to talk to him because he hates her voice, which makes his mother terribly disheartened, after which she takes out her phone and says that they have left, so he must take care of himself and remember to eat. His mother is very much concerned about the state of affairs of her son. He behaves asocially, yells at her, casually communicates with every member of the family, although they never did anything bad to him. They only wished him well. At that time, the son continued to play on his computer, calling his teammates names on the team. It absolutely does not matter to him how much his mother worries about him. He is not interested in a single person on this earth. The family at this time is already in the car and is heading to rest along one of the highways. At this time the father, who is driving, does not understand when his son Hyun will finally grow up, because a little more and he will turn into a hikikomori, but can't cope with the pronunciation of this word, so he says that he will soon turn into a recluse. At this moment, there is a heavy atmosphere in the car. Everyone is well aware of how deplorable the situation of their loved one is. His mother, sister, and also dad himself are aware of this. The father turns to his wife and asks why she allows him to behave like this. She is his mother, but at this moment the daughter wedged into the quarrel, saying that there is nothing to blame on her mother. The daughter reports that everything could have been completely different if he had placed the upbringing not only on his mother, but for this he needed to be at home much more often, and not like now once every few months. The father is angry at these words, because he works so that his whole family can provide for their desires, as well as earn a piece of bread. At this moment he thinks that he is absolutely not appreciated. At this moment, Hyun's mother asks to stop the quarrel because of him, because now they are doing well, they are going on vacation together. So after the rest it will be possible to talk and deal with all the problems, but now you need to rest. At this moment, the daughter asks for forgiveness for the words spoken. The father turns to her to look at her. He also asks her forgiveness, because every time he sees his son, he cannot help but get angry. While dad was distracted from the road, they drove into the oncoming lane, so the daughter screams for him to be careful, but in the oncoming lane, a huge and heavy car carrying cargo is already approaching at great speed, and they fly right at her. The father turns his head towards the road and sees that the collision can no longer be avoided, and the headlights of the heavy truck are already blinding them, since they are in inevitable proximity to him. At this moment, an accident occurs, where all members of his family die in a terrible accident. No one manages to save them. On this day his mother, father and his sister died at the same time. After some time, closer to the night, an unfamiliar number calls him on his phone, so at first he, as always, rejects it, dropping the call. But he gets a few more calls and he still aggressively picks up his phone. The names of his relatives are listed to him. He confirms that all the listed names are the names of his relatives. And then silence hangs in the receiver for a second and he is told that all his relatives died in a car accident. He asks the caller one more time, asking him to repeat what he said again. He has repeated all the information, after which he puts the phone directly in front of him and dead silence reigns in the room. Cha Hyun is the main character who recently turned 18 years old. He was a high school student. He was socially phobic by nature, and also prone to self-destruction. He did not go to school, and now he has also lost loved ones. From now on, he was completely alone. For a long time he sat on his bed in a dark room, looking into the void and not breaking the silence. It is difficult to describe exactly what he felt at the moment, because it was not revealed, but I think that he was trying to rethink his life, but did not understand why it was the moment he should have caught on to sort himself out. A few days later he sent to school and passed by a gardener mowing the grass with a hand lawn mower, the mower blades spinning incredibly fast, as it should be. At one point, the blades touched something hard, so one of the blades, due to the force of the torque, breaks off the lawn mower and flies right in front of Hyun's nose as he walks to school. It crashes into a tree and goes halfway into the trunk of the tree, which makes Hyun very surprised, because he didn't even understand what just happened. So he stops and looks at the blade that entered the tree for a while. The gardener, finally realizing that one of his blades has flown away and could injure a passing person, apologizes, because if he walked a little faster, then trouble would definitely happen. He once again apologizes to him, because he was not supposed to work as a gardener today, but the gardener did not come to work, so he had to combine the functions of a security guard and a gardener today. The man reports that he sees him here for the first time, after which he asks why exactly he came here, and at that moment an awkward pause hung in the air. Hyun quietly replies that he moved here, but he says it so quietly that the guard standing a meter away from him cannot make out a word, so he asks him to speak louder and repeat what exactly he said. He gathers his courage and repeats several times, each time speaking louder so that the guard will definitely hear. The man reports that he was informed that today he should just move into apartment number 1410, so he assumes that he will be the new tenant. The man asks if he will live there alone and an awkward silence reigns again. Hyun quietly says again that he is going to live here alone, but the guard again does not hear anything, because he says it to himself under his breath, which no one would have heard. Hyun gathers courage again and replies that he is going to live here alone. It is clear that he is so uncomfortable talking to someone live, he is notorious and asocial. The guard, after a short silence, decided to ask him a couple more questions, starting with the fact that it was not too early for him to move from his parents, and also when he was going to transport things. Hyun replies loudly enough that one can hear and even make out the words that he is going to transport things in the late afternoon, so the guard, having received the answers, decides not to torture the strange guy anymore. The man invites him to come to him in the evening so that he can tell the new tenant of this house about order and life, to which Hyun agrees and incredibly quickly moves away from him. The man follows him with his eyes and does not understand what kind of strange guy is moving in with them, because Hyun almost ran away from him after the conversation ended. The man drew attention to his gloved hand, which was damaged by a lawn mower blade. His white glove was partially stained red, and another small piece of the blade was sticking out. Hyun passes through the entrance, rises to the floor he needs and enters the apartment, after which he throws his things near the entrance and goes to look at the apartment. He goes to the window, peers for a long time and concludes that there is a hole forgotten by God in front of him, after which he closes the window with curtains and curtains, because of which darkness reigns in the room. He sits on the floor, leaning against one of the walls. At that moment he realizes that there is a real black streak in his life, because of which he despairs and plunges into his thoughts. He does not understand how such a tragedy happened, especially since his sister was so young, and his father has succeeded quite a lot lately in his work, so he understands that he had a wonderful family, and all his family members were very good people. On the day of the funeral, few people came, some were from his father's work, there were close friends of his family, and everyone was waiting for Hyun to come. Everyone was indignant because he couldn't even come on time. Someone even tried to call him, but he did not answer. Someone from the crowd declares that his parents have been worried about him all his life, and he cannot even come to their funeral. During these words, Hyun entered the room. He walked in slippers, so when walking there were soft sounds of slaps. Everyone looked at him and did not understand how this child could be from such wonderful parents. Someone from the crowd called him a family shame, someone commented on his appearance, focusing on slippers, but Hyun stood right in front of the coffins of his relatives and was silent. In the next moment, he said that he had calculated everything and on all three accounts that belonged to his parents, he found only $20,000, and how could he live on them? He began to yell at the people who came that he was useless cattle, and at that moment he did not understand at all how he could live on these pennies. Hyun's words, so they decided to throw him out of this place so that he would not dishonor the honor of the family. He was thrown out in his arms outside the door of the room where a funeral service for the family of the dead took place, and after that the door closed right in front of his nose, and he remained sitting opposite it. At this moment, we seem to see that a bifurcation has occurred, because exactly the same guy is sitting behind him, but he condemns all his today's actions. Hyun decided to calculate how much money left from the family would be enough for him. He figured that if he spends $30 a day, then he needs $900 a month. Then he decides to multiply 900 by 12 months and receives $10,800 in costs per year. despite the fact that he is going to buy food on them, pay for the internet and electricity. His second personality looks at him from behind and wonders how cynical and low he is, that all he cares about now is how much money is left and how he will spend it. At this moment, the main character realizes that he can sell the house in order to get even more money, which should definitely be enough for more time, then he would buy himself a one-room apartment, which would be completely enough for his existence. After a while, he again found himself at home, where he again sat down against the wall, not understanding what to do with his life. Then he thinks of committing suicide, after which he takes out his phone, opens the calendar and chooses for this the day that should become the 25th of March. A few moments later he received a call. It turned out that the delivery men with his furniture and his things would be somewhat delayed, so they would arrive much later than agreed. Of those things that he himself transported, he took out the system unit and monitor, put out the boxes so that it resembled a desktop, after which he activated his computer and, not understanding what to do all day without the internet, tried to connect to existing networks in the house. Since he did not find any networks without a password, he simply fell on his back from a sitting position and looked around the ceiling, on which a flat chandelier hung, and a small spider crawled next to it. Suddenly, he heard a voice that incredibly loudly and terribly turned to him with the question, what is he going to do with all this next? He abruptly got up and began to look around, not understanding who exactly addressed him. It also seemed that this something was so close to him. However, as soon as he looked around he did not find anyone. At that moment, his doorbell rang, so he glanced at the intercom with a screen on which he saw the guard he had already seen earlier this morning. Hyun opened the door and asked the guard for what reason he was disturbing him. Then the man behind the door decided to warn him that the construction company, due to poor maintenance, has friction with the law and the government, so if someone comes to collect signatures, you don't have to sign anything. Hyun said that since he was not interested at all, he would definitely not sign anything, after which he asked the guard to leave him alone and not disturb him anymore today, because he was very tired. The guard apologizes for keeping him for a long time and decides to leave. Before he left, he announced that he had a small gift for him and held out a small bottle of juice in his hand. Hyung asked why he was giving him juice, to which the guard replied that it was a small housewarming present, and then left. At that moment, a girl came out of the next room, who continued to communicate with her mother on the phone even after leaving the apartment. The girl promised her mother that she was going to the audition for the last time, so if she failed it again, she would never dare to go to such events again. She also says that she has an incredibly good feeling, so she has to go to this audition today. Walking near Hyun's apartment, she continued to talk to her mother, and Hyun stood at the door and watched everything that was happening in the corridor. They exchanged glances, after which the girl continued to walk to the elevator, and Hyun continued to stand in the door and follow her with his eyes. He thought that he was an actress, and also noticed that she would hardly have been so beautiful if she had not done facial plastic surgery, after which he stopped looking at the leaving girl and slammed the door. Sometimes it seemed to him how his life might have turned out if he had not stretched out his hand in one of his memories. He continued to lie on the floor and continued to recall some fragments from his memory. After a while, he decided to stop analyzing his memories, so he turned on some movie on his computer and lay down to watch it. At the time of watching the film, he became so bored and dreary that he did not even understand what exactly this film was about, so he looked at the screen and saw how the picture was changing. Outside the door, the sound of approaching heels could be heard down the hallway, the sounds getting louder and louder as someone walked in the direction of Hyun's door. He dared to assume that it was his neighbor, who was returning to the casting, and something interested her in these sounds, so he paused his film and began to wonder how she could return at such a late hour. Hyun's room, how the door of the neighbor opened and closed, followed by a dull sound of the lock. The neighbor took off her heels and walked around the room. Her every step was clearly audible, which confused Hyun a little. At that moment, it even began to seem to him that the walls of his apartment were made of paper or something even thinner, because he literally heard all the steps, all the conversations and all the actions of the neighbor behind the wall. Hyun very much, so he recoiled from the wall. He returned to his computer, sat down at it and turned on the stop film again. He was still not fascinated by what was happening on the screen. Now he had thoughts in his head about what this charming girl neighbor looked like in the shower, and as soon as he imagined it, then immediately stopped sitting in his thoughts so that they would not turn in that direction again. After sitting in silence for a couple of minutes, incredibly loud sounds of playing the bass guitar began to be heard from above. The girl from above, actively playing the bass guitar, still had time to sing, so some more words came from behind the wall, but it was hard to completely disassemble them, because that the bass guitar partially overlapped them. Hyun didn't understand how the walls and floors and ceilings of this house could be so thin that you could literally hear everything that his neighbors were doing, so he even called this house a cesspool out of anger. Time passed and Hyun lived in this house for a week, but he felt completely disgusted, because he ate only one fast food, and he left all the boxes, packages and jars in his room, because he did not care about everything around him. He continued to sit at his computer, playing games, also writing comments on the forums, filling them with bile, burning his life in his only available entertainment, the computer. So today he went back to sleep on his bed and quickly fell asleep. At night, he woke up from a message that came to his phone. He was left by a food delivery man who could not get through to Hyun because he was sleeping, so he left all his food outside the door of his apartment. He quickly got dressed and went out to pick up his order outside the door, and as soon as he opened the door, he saw that the box of his ramen had been torn open and several packages were missing. The packages were torn on the floor, and the ramen was partially eaten. All these packages led to the next apartment, and the door to the apartment where the girl neighbor lived was open. He came closer to the neighbor's door and looked inside, where he saw huge drops of blood on the floor. He thought that it could be nosebleed, but there was too much of it, so he decided to go further and find out what was happening inside. He went inside the apartment and heard that someone was sitting in the dark and munching loudly. Ramen was scattered on the floor in the apartment, and there were also drops of blood on the floor. Hyung didn't understand at first why the neighbor girl was eating his ramen, because it was not bought for her, and also what drops of blood were doing here. Then at that moment, from around the corner in the room, someone threw a cat collar that rolled across the floor, and all this time he rang with a bell sewn to him. The collar was covered in blood. Hyung held his breath at what he saw, because he now did not understand what was happening here, and in a moment a long red hand reached out for this collar from behind the wall. This hand did not look like a human, it was definitely some kind of monster. At that moment, Hyun decides to get out of this apartment as quickly as possible, so he retreats out of the apartment in order not to make a lot of noise, but does not notice how a package of ramen gets under his foot. When he stepped on it, there was a loud noise from the packaging, because of which the monster immediately reacted to this sound and headed towards him. Hyun at that moment decided to run to his apartment as soon as possible to save his life. As soon as he entered the apartment, Hyun closed the door with all the locks, after which he moved away from it and crawled under the bed, because there were no more places where you could hide at least a little and feel safe. Hyun was under the bed and thinking about what he had just seen today, because it was definitely not a person, but who then it was. He recalled this picture from a neighboring apartment several times, after which he came to the conclusion that it was definitely a monster. The monster at that moment was already at his door and started calling him, as well as knocking, which only made Hyun even more panicked. After that, the monster decided to speak and began to pretend to be a neighbor girl, but his voice was not at all like her sound. Hyun plucked up courage and decided to look at the screen at the intercom to see who was behind the door, and it was really his girlfriend who was standing outside the door. She did not look important, she cried and was in a panic, and also often turned around and looked around. The girl behind the door begged him to help. She described the whole situation that happened outside the door, and Hyun did not understand whether that girl was really standing in front of him or it was a monster that had taken the form of a girl. He tried to somehow check whether there really was a girl in front of him, so he asked to show her his hands, but at that moment the girl hesitated and could not tell him anything. She just looked at him through the intercom. The girl's face after a moment began to change into monster-like forms. She asked him to open this damn door, and Hyun realized that there was a monster behind the door who tried to lure him to him. She screamed even louder, but Hyun was not going to open the door of his apartment. At that moment, the upstairs neighbor began to play her bass guitar, which was heard by the monster standing outside the door, so he immediately went to the floor above along the stairs next to his door. Once that monster was gone, he plucked up his courage, broke his mop so he could fight back, and opened the door. There was no one outside the door, so he pointed his homemade spear in the direction of the landing and waited to see what would happen next. After a few moments, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching him with every second, someone descending the stairs, so Hyun was ready to see the monster in person any second. Hyun understood that the hero from him was so he hesitated in absolutely all his actions. Droplets of sweat appeared on his face, and he himself was almost at the limit of panic. At that moment, one of the tenants of this building came out from the landing, complaining about the situation with the elevators. He came out and noticed Hyun, who was standing with a mop pointed at him, and there was fear in his eyes. The guy who came out of the landing did not immediately understand what was happening here. He saw drops of blood on the floor, him with a mop, scattered ramen. So he turned to Hyun to explain what was happening here. Hyung asked him if this guy had seen the monster since he went up the stairs, but he didn't like that answer, so he swung at Hyun with exclamations if he was bullying him. At that moment, Hyun's nose bled, although no one hit him, and the guy only swung at him. The blood continued to pour without stopping, because of which Hyun staggered and fell to the floor in the corridor outside his apartment right in front of the guy, who no longer understood what was happening here. At this time, the girl playing the bass guitar began to be annoyingly knocked on the door, and the knock was so strong and incessant that this girl thought that she had angered the neighbors with her playing, so they came to the noise. She went to the intercom and wanted to apologize, but a monster girl appeared on the screen in front of her, who had just left Hyun at the sound of the bass playing. The girl did not even immediately realize that she was not the most ordinary tenant of this house, until she peered into her face. The monster screamed that she wanted to eat, her face was torn, her eyes rolled back, and blood was coming from her mouth. After a moment, she began to knock out the door, because of which she missed from each blow more and more. The girl began to scream that if she did not stop, she would call the police, and after that she took the bat into her hands and prepared for the fact that she would have to fight back. At this time, the guy who was at Hyun's apartment and didn't understand why Hyun fell down and passed out heard a noise upstairs, so he decided to go take a look at what was going on in their house today. As soon as he climbed to the floor above, the monster was gone, the sound of breaking glass was heard, most likely the monster jumped out there. There were dents in the door, and blood led from the door to the window, which confirmed the hypothesis of a jumping monster. As soon as the guy approached the door, which had dents, the door was opened by a girl with a bat in her hand. The girl asked if he had seen a monster girl who had just burst into his door, and her face was covered in blood. He decides to close the door where the monster had just burst, looked at the dents, and then hit it with all his might, and the size of his dent was several times smaller. He turned to the girl standing next to her to tell the truth, because the girl could not leave such a dent, but she reports that she is telling him the truth. After a few moments, they went down to the floor below, picked up Hyun and carried him to their apartment, placing him on the bed. After that, they tried to call an ambulance so that the doctors would come and see him, but no one answered the phone. They tried to call the police, but no one took it there either, so the inflated guy decided that the main problem now was with communication, since no one could take it in any department. The girl sitting next to his bed checks to see if he is breathing, after which she concludes that he is just sleeping. At that moment, Hyun's nose bled again in a dream, so she cleaned it up with one of the tissues nearby. The girl then offers to go to the security, since no one answers, but the guy replies that this can be a risky task, because someone really walks around the building, who has such strength that it is enough to almost knock out the door. The guy decides to go to the security post on his own, leaving her with Hyun. He ordered her to wait here and not go anywhere, after which he left the apartment. At this time, there were already many people at the guard post, standing and banging on the door. No one understands what is happening, and what is happening here. From this the panic of people only increased with every moment. When the inflated guy finally went down to the security post, he saw a large crowd of people. He turned to one of the girls standing there to tell him what was happening here, to which the girl said that the elevator was not working, and all the exits were from buildings are blocked, no one answers in the security service, and the door is locked, pointing at it with a hand. There is also no connection, so they were completely blocked from the rest of the world. But the guy did not leave the thought of where the old guard was. The girl replied that no one had seen him since yesterday, and there was complete silence at the duty post. Also, all emergency exits were closed, the fire exit was closed, the exit to the parking lot was also closed, even the underground parking was closed. The building was completely cut off from the outside world. The guy wondered if it could be that everything that was happening was directly related to the appearance of a monster in their building. The girl who heard his thoughts was incredibly surprised because she heard the word monster. A second later, the girl's brother appeared, carrying a fire extinguisher in his hands. He decided to break the lock on the door of the duty station to open the door, so he swung and hit the doorknob. The door handle flew off, after which this guy opened the door and turned on the light. There was no one behind the door, only an empty room. An old man who ran into the room decided to immediately open all the exits, starting with the main one. He pressed the button to open the main entrance, after which the shutters began to rise, and a strange person appeared outside the door, who looked more like a monster. The shutters rose higher and the people standing behind the glass became more and more terrible with every second, because they could make out that it was definitely not a person standing behind the glass. especially since he was bleeding from his mouth. The monster standing behind the glass, as soon as the shutters went up, said that he would kill them all and began to lick the glass behind which there were people. Everyone behind the glass was in a panic and did not understand what was happening, because he did not look like a person at all. The brother of that girl screamed for the shutters to be pulled back as quickly as possible, because the monster had already pierced the glass with its tongue and penetrated it inside, which made the whole situation seem even more terrible.